Hey everyone, Xerath here, and today we're going to be talking about Dark Seal. So this item is something that people talk about quite a bit when it comes to artillery mages, specifically like Vel'Koz and Xerath, with the idea being, that since you're generally further away and at what's thought to be safe ranges, you're more easily able to stack Dark Seal and thus get more value out of it. And the main question that gets asked is is this good on these champions? Like, should I buy it? When should I buy it? Are there certain situations where I shouldn't buy it at all? Right. So I kind of want to just cover everything Dark Seal, and we're going to be talking about this from the perspective of Xerath. I may do videos on other champions. A lot of these points are, they transfer over to the other champions, but there are some specific things with Xerath, so I'll just do video by video. And we'll talk about the perspective of building it on mid versus the perspective of building it on support. And then we'll talk about when you should upgrade it, if ever. And that'll do it. So let's get right into things. So should you build Dark Seal on mid Xerath? And the answer is pretty much always. And that's for a couple reasons. Basically, on mid, you are going to have access to a lot more resources, a lot more gold, right? So the idea is that it's not as big of a deal for you to spend some portion of your resources early on an item like Dark Seal, because you're kind of getting in excess of them. Oftentimes, too, mid laners, or even if you're playing at bot, the same will apply. You could take this advice for mid or bot. With the amount of gold you'll pretty much have your first item before the first major encounter, like the first major skirmish. Or you'll either have it or you won't, regardless, right? So that it's unlikely that 350 gold will be the breaking point, in my opinion, between you having the item or not. Which means that in that case, it's typically decent to have it earlier, because then you can start getting stacks on it, right? So there's that aspect. And then the other thing is, because of your unique situation on the map being in mid, right, and you can obviously both help out the fights on bot side of the map with Dragon, or fights surrounding Rift Herald at the top or Grubs earlier on, right, you're in a position where you're more likely to get stacks than somebody who's in bot lane. Obviously, it's not impossible for bot lane to get stacks. You obviously have a ranged ultimate, right? But you just have a lot more opportunities, I feel like, in mid lane, especially early. Especially because Grub seems to be the kind of thing that's contested first a lot of times, even before Dragon, right? So I think those two reasons alone are pretty good reasons why you would want to build it on mid. And then, are there any reasons why you wouldn't want to build it on mid? Well, I think the main reason would be just if they have a team that's very, very bad for Xerath. So, if you feel like you're going to be getting killed a lot. Now, my first question would be, why are you playing Xerath into a team like this, right? But if you do end up in this situation and you just feel like you can't, really get many stacks on the Dark Seal, or you won't be able to, then perhaps it's better to just either spend that 350 gold on more damage to hit your power spikes a bit sooner, or invest in something like Azania's to keep yourself alive, right? So there are situations where, I wouldn't buy it on mid, but in most cases you're going to be buying it on mid. Now, when should you buy it on mid, right? So, like I was talking about earlier, because you have more gold, you have a bit more flexibility in terms of building it earlier. And also, because your primary role in mid lane, especially early on in the game, is just going to be to basically clear waves, having a bit of extra AP from the Dark Seal is kind of nice. And it's basically like you were just buying kind of like another AP item, right? So you don't really lose a ton by buying it, because it's fairly gold efficient AP-wise for its price, right? It's not completely out of line in terms of the AP you get from it versus just buying another book or something like that, right? Which means that it can make the difference sometimes in those situations where you need a little bit more extra AP to clear the wave, right? And it's not like you're really sacrificing that on mid. Whereas if you're playing on support bot and you're harassing people mostly, that 15 additional AP is probably not going to be the difference maker on a lot of your engagements down in bot, but it could definitely be the difference maker in terms of, do I clear this wave? Can I get that CS, right? So I think building it earlier on mid is more acceptable. Of course, you could always wait until you get your first item and then build it after that. It's not really that much of a problem either way. Something you can do too is you can kind of read the game state, right? So if the game is kind of very loose and there's a lot of conflict going on, a lot of people are dying, you notice that it might be easier to pick up kills or assists, you can just opt to build it earlier. And if the game is kind of a bit more stagnant, or if their side's winning kind of hard and your side is struggling to get kills, then sometimes it can be better to just reinvest 350 gold earlier into that, hitting that first item, the Luden's Companion, getting that power spike, and then you're kind of more effective in combat a little bit earlier, right? And then that'll help getting the kills rolling, and you can always buy the Dark Seal immediately after finishing the Luden's Companion, right? So that's pretty much when I would build it on mid. And then there's another point to kind of consider here where if you do build it before your first item, it's kind of like all the same, right? Because it's going to delay your build by the same amount, 350 gold at every stage. So typically you'd want to build it earlier than later, right? And that would be because if you obviously get a kill or an assist earlier, it helps already beginning to stack that. Whereas if you bought it kind of right before you're about to finish your Ludens, you may have already missed out on kills and assists. Now, there's a couple situations where you may not want to do that. I think they specifically come up more on support. They tend to, but there could be a situation on mid. So the two components items for Luden's Companion are the book, which gives like the mana back as you level, right? And then the Hextech Alternator. And I feel like on mid, some people like to rush this first to help with their mana sustain a little bit, right? So you could rush to that and then build the Dark Seal on Ring. And if you're playing support, it tends to be the opposite, where you kind of want to rush the Hextech Alternator and deal a little bit more damage, get a little bit more harass down. And if you really do want to do that, you can build the ring after Hextech Alternator. So those would be the only cases where I think I would build the ring after building a component of the item, right? And that's a fairly decent compromise because you still have halfway to go. It's not like you're buying the ring right before you're finishing the item, you know what I mean? So something to keep in mind there on situations where you may want to buy it for your first item but not right away. But generally speaking, if you're going to buy it for your first item, you want to get it as fast as you can. So support, right? When do you buy on support? And the answer is pretty much going to be the same as mid. I would say that pretty much unequivocally always. But there's kind of one more caveat that mid doesn't really have, and that is if you need to buy heal cut, there's an interesting scenario that comes up because you actually sort of run out of space if you're trying to encapsulate your whole build. And when you think about it, you have your support item, it's one item, right? Your boots, 2 items. You're definitely going to have boots in the early game. Then you're going to have your Luden's Companion, it's 3 items, and your Dark Seal, let's say you bought a Dark Seal, it's 4 items. And then Liandry's and Void Staff would be your 5th and 6th items, right? And that's kind of rounding out your like all-purposes build, right? You have an item for every situation. You've got the burst item with mana in the Ludens. You've got the percent HP item to help deal with that as the game scales more, right? And people buy HP items. And then you also have the magic penetration, which helps just baseline, right? Because remember you're not full penning with just your boots. So it even helps if they're not stacking MR, and then if they are stacking MR, it gets even better, right? So in order to kind of fit those 3 items into your build, you have to drop the Dark Seal. And that would be important if you need to buy Heal Cut, right? And what I tend to do actually is if I'm sure I'm going to need Heal Cut, then I won't buy the Dark Seal at all, and I'll go immediately into a Heal Cut item, so the Orb, like directly after the first item, which tends to be Luden's Companion. So I go Luden's Companion into Orb. and that's kind of how I deal with heal cut. And in my eyes, what this means is like it means that because since Darksteel, in my opinion, is a pretty good item, it means that in order to really run heal cut, you want to make absolutely sure you're going to get good value out of that orb, right? So I tend not to build heal cut against things that aren't super concerning, you know, like something like a Soraka, very important. Whereas like, you know, I see a lot of people rushing heal cut against Volibear. I feel like sometimes it's not the most important. Maybe I would get it against Volibear if there's another healing threat in the team, you know, so you kind of have to balance these things out and for yourself kind of play test it. One way you could do it is you could start buying heal cut in kind of situations where whenever you think you need it, and then once you realize you're not getting as much value in certain situations, that's where you like limit it down. That's kind of how I did it. You kind of just have to play through the game and kind of get a sense of, okay, like what am I going to be attacking at this time? How much healing am I actually going to be able to remove off this target, etc., right? And once you kind of like get a feel for that through playing, you can kind of better adjust whether you need it or not. But the goal is to not buy this item because it kind of doesn't let you buy Darksteel unless you want to give up one of the other items, which is possible. If they're not tanky, you don't really need the Andres, but again, most characters in this game nowadays just kind of get like pseudo-tanky. You know, like they're not true tanks or anything, but their items give them HP. They have HP from the runes. The durability patch gave them more HP by default, right? So the Andres is actually quite a potent threat against most champions in the game, even without much additional health. And then when do you buy Darksteel on support? So this differs from mid a little bit in that I typically don't buy Darksteel on support until after the first item. And like I said, it does depend. Those situations from earlier still come into play. So if I notice I'm very easily able to get kills on the enemy bot lane, and I think we can snowball it, I may purchase a Darksteel in that particular matchup. But you also have to remember that, you know, just being able to buy your Luden's Companion earlier is also going to generate more kills, right? Getting that extra burst when you're already winning is really nice. So it does come to be like a game time decision. I think you really have to kind of think for yourself, like, am I going to be able to get more kills with this item significantly more, or do I want to maybe get a few less kills and get some stacks on here, right, with the kills I am able to get. It's a little bit of a decision you have to make there. I typically tend to build the Darksteel after, though, because I like to just go into the full damage and have the Ludens as quickly as possible, basically, because it hits harder at that point, right? And then, you could build it like after your Hex Tech or something like that, right, if you really wanted, but I find that on support, it's just better to build it later, especially because you don't have as many opportunities to stack kills on it in a lot of cases, because even though it is a 2v2 lane, people tend to play kind of safe if you're doing well or you're ahead, so you don't really get as many opportunities as you kind of climb up the ladder. Now, another topic that also kind of comes up is gold efficiency when you talk about this item, right? And I kind of want to talk a little bit about gold efficiency. As I think, like, put simply, it's basically, you could think of it as just like, if you take every item and you boil it down to its kind of like base component, right? Or every, every stat in the game, and you boil it down to items that just grant it from a base component level, it's like, how efficient is any particular item in terms of giving you that stat for a certain amount of gold relative to other items, right? And Darksteel actually comes out to be a fairly efficient item. It's got the HP on it, it's got the ability power, right? So it's definitely a fairly strong item, and even with no stacks, I think it's like barely gold efficient, or it's like maybe a little bit under gold efficient, right? So it's a good item even at base, and then the idea is it has upside, right? Because you have the 10 stacks, and that should theoretically boost the gold efficiency by quite a bit, which it does. So this tends to be the default argument for running it on the artillery mages, right? Well, it's like, well, you're going to stay alive at least a majority of the time. Like, even if you don't keep it at full all the time, you're going to die less than like a melee champion. right? So you're going to have it stacked up a lot, and you're always going to be very positive in that gold efficiency stat from this item, basically, right? So that means there's no reason not to build it whatsoever. You should build it every time. That's kind of like the logic that follows from it. And I think that is like, it's mostly correct, but it doesn't really account for everything, right? So it doesn't like account for hitting your first spike a little bit faster, right? Which could be very important, because obviously you're just doing way more damage having a Ludens than even having a Dark Seal with a couple stacks on it, right? It's just not really comparable, not the same at all. And but more importantly, I think something that it tends to miss out on is the way it interacts with what I would call specialty items like Liandry's and Ludens and Void, right? So all these items have like an effect, like Ludens is the burst one, right? Void is to get through MR, and Liandry's is to get through health. And you'll notice that neither Darkseal nor its evolved equivalent, the Magi Soul Stealer, has any particular combat effect that's like strong, right? It's just raw AP. Now it does give you 10% move speed, right, which can be good on certain champions. Not the greatest on Xerath, in my opinion, especially because he's already kind of got a low base movement speed, and on top of that, he's rooting himself a lot with Q and R, right? So it's not like the most important thing, but something to consider for sure, right? And basically, the idea is that these items like Darkseal and Magi's, they can't ever fill in the gap left by like things like magic penetration or health penetration or stuff like that. So even if you have a fairly stacked Darkseal, it may not be quite as good as you think, because if you're missing some of the other important components to a well-rounded all-around build, right, like magic penetration or health penetration, then those things would give you pretty close to the damage, right? Or they give you pretty close to the damage that the Magi is getting you, right? And the one case where this does sort of favor the Magi pretty strongly is in terms of the price per AP, right? So if you have like an actual 25 stack Magi's, that is pretty gold efficient, because it doesn't really cost that much, right? It almost costs like half of what a typical mythic item would cost. But if you're not in that situation and you have like a more normalized thing where you have like 10 stacks on it or 8 stacks or 12 stacks, it's a lot closer to these other items than people think. You know what I mean? And it's not really only that, because the other aspect of it is it kind of comes down to when are you purchasing like an upgrade for these items, right? Because the idea is that if you upgrade from a 10 stack Darkseal to a Magi's, right, you keep the same amount of stacks, but you only go up 20 AP. So you essentially spend 1,150 gold for 20 AP, and the idea is that you're going to gain some of that value in gold back over time as you add kills or assists onto it, right? And it kind of begins to stack up, and the idea is that the earlier you build it, the better, because it has more time to generate the stacks, right? But I think personally, losing like the 1,250 in stats, I guess you get like 25 AP for it, but it's not great, right? So like losing that progress towards another item, specifically an item that may matter quite a bit, like a Void Staff or Leandre's, depending on what the enemy team is deciding to itemize with. Not really sure if that's always going to be worth it. That's something you kind of really need to consider there. And a lot of times I don't really like the idea of, I feel like I'm blocking up my tempo, right? Because I'm kind of accelerating through the game towards this build that'll let me handle anything. And then converting to a Magi's like midway through that kind of throws a wrench into the plans. And it doesn't necessarily work out so well, right? So just something to kind of consider there, right, is that, gold efficiency, the item's pretty much always going to be gold efficient in a lot of cases, but gold efficiency isn't necessarily the king of everything, right? It does depend on what the opponent is building, and, you may want to adjust your your build accordingly. Typically, when I upgrade it would be at the end. So basically, I'll have like my boots, my support item, my Ludens, my Leandries, and my Void Staff. And then I'll have the Dark Seal that's at like 10 stacks, and then I'll upgrade it. And then if I get that to 25 stacks by the end game, I can kind of sell boots and get a Rabadons, and I'll have like 900 AP. Or if not, I just stay on the 10 stack Dark Seal with the 10 stack Dark Seal with Ludens, Void Staff, and Leandry. And that's pretty much the end game build. Now, I think it is silly to not upgrade it if you're already basically maxed out, right? So I would upgrade it in the case where I had a Void Staff, Ludens, and a Leandry, as well as boots. So that would be a situation I would upgrade it in. And yeah. So I think like another big red flag for upgrading to a Magi's is like it's kind of like the same as the as why you would start the game with a Dark Seal or not start the game but buy it early. It's like if you notice that their enemy team has champions that are going to make it most impossible for you to keep your stacks, then you really probably should steer away from converting the Dark Seal into Magi's. Like, absolutely, if you haven't done it already, because it's just going to be like a nightmare to maintain at that point, right? But again, all this stuff kind of has to, parse through your brain via the game state, right? Because there's going to be some cases where even though there's things that can theoretically dive you well, you have really good answers for them, or they're just not diving you, they're diving somebody else, or maybe they're not diving at all, maybe they're too far behind to really impact the game, right? So you kind of have to think for yourself a bit here and make adjustments on the fly. But I would say, generally speaking, I just do not like upgrading to the Magi's because it's just a big tempo loss, right? When you could be spending the gold in other areas. So, yeah. And I think that's pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, feel free to drop them in the comments. Like, subscribe if you enjoyed this. And I will see you guys next time.